Everyone, really excited to kind of have the second installment of kind of power, energy, and infrastructure. The first iteration of this I did with a energy attorney, Dan Garcia, and today I have Katie Klaber joining me to talk a little bit about energy markets, kind of where we stand, and I think maybe dispelling some of the prevailing myths around what's the difference between kind of the price of oil that we see and the price that people are transacting at. Also some issues around supply, demand, and this idea of how do we power data centers while also making sure that our daily lives are, we're still able to go through it. So
yeah. Lots to cover.
Lots to cover. And Katie's actually joining us for the second time. But for those of you that did not see the first time we taped a video with Katie, maybe introduce yourself to the Schneider Downs audience.
No, it's great to work with Schneider Downs on a lot of different fronts over my career, but do a lot of work in the energy industry and really got that the basis in the basin when the Marcellus was up and running, and it was a privilege to work with that industry early in the shale revolution.
It was very, very interesting, to kind of see how some of the characters, both past, present, and then continuing into the future, help build what I think is one of America's really big advantages. In addition to being the home of what I think, from a pro-capitalist standpoint, the amount of businesses being formed in the U.S. Is a winning edge for our country. And I think the second winning edge is our ability, to harness the immense amount of resources that lie beneath. And
a lot of good, smart people coaxing those molecules out of the ground.
Yes, absolutely. And so for those, we're filming this, for those of you kind of wondering, and from a context perspective, we are filming this on Tuesday, July 21st. And that's important because obviously the price of oil, which we're going to talk about, it moves around a lot. Sometimes it moves around, within the hour. So right now, you've got West Texas trading at around 85.5, Brent trading just a little bit under 92, and natural gas trading at 289. So I think from that perspective, when we talk about where things are, some of the things that are maybe impacting those numbers, it's good to have that as a base assumption. So with that being said, we're going to kind of go into the state of the energy market. And I think, it would be good if you could just talk about what is kind of driving. We had that initial burst once the conflict in Iran started. We got into, triple digits, but we've seen that come down kind of anywhere from, it's been in the trading range is kind of high 70s to low 90s. What's kind of driving that, kind of the resilience and the stability of the price in the energy markets?
Well, I think the simple answer is supply, right? We have a lot of optionality in this country now. The infrastructure, whereas it's not perfectly built out, it's certainly a lot better built out than if this had happened 20 years ago. And a lot of that supply, it's diversified geographically. Mm-hmm. So Appalachia, we can talk about at some point here, certainly playing a huge role. But just in the last 20 years, we've more than doubled our natural gas production on a daily basis. We've more than doubled our oil production. Natural gas liquids, we might talk about, very important building block of a lot of our economy. That went from literally almost nothing in the Appalachian Basin to now our country is the largest NGL producer in the world. So a lot of supply.
Yeah, and I think that's important too, to kind of the focus on regional diversification. I think for some of the people that don't maybe pay attention to the energy markets, but watch Landman, of which I'm a big fan of, they might think that everything begins and ends.
That's on my list.
begins and ends in Texas, right? And I think we're there's so much more to the energy to the energy grid, to powering a lot of cities that have grown significantly over the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, you're talking about, the Marcellus and the Utica and, through Appalachia, they have direct, correlations and connections to the Sun Belt, which is, the fastest growing region in the country. That ability to source energy from different parts of the of the country has certainly helped us progress in this. Going back to the conversation I had with Dan Garcia, talking about AI and data centers and the build out. If your energy is only coming from one place, it becomes much more of a logistical issue.
Right.
Obviously, you talked a lot about supply. We talked about LNG. I don't necessarily know that the average person knows how much liquid natural gas that we're exporting.
Natural gas liquids important to the petrochemical industry. There was so much more natural gas liquids in the Marcellus and Utica than was anticipated. Mm-hmm. That's an export, so a lot of that's going to Europe to make polyethylene because their facilities were very natural gas liquid based, not naphtha. Right here in our backyard, Shell Chemical would not be here but for that ethane. So the natural gas liquids are a great story, not a byproduct, but an amazing source material. LNG, 20 years ago, that was, I think about Cove Point, Maryland. That LNG facility was built to import natural gas when we were at $14 a million BTU. That and several other plants have been turned around to be exporting.
Okay.
Whereas there was such a lack of LNG export capacity, we've gotten dozens of new plants permitted, mostly out of the Gulf Coast. But that LNG export is playing a major geopolitical role now, right? It's a really important geopolitical asset for our country to be able to provide our allies with natural gas. There's about 20 countries that we are essentially competing with, and some of them are closer to the markets that are buying. And when you think about an LNG, a molecule has to come, from the ground somewhere here domestically, has to get to one of these LNG export facilities. So let's say it's in the Gulf. You have to liquefy that, so take that temperature, way down, get that into a liquid form so it can fit into a tanker, send that to its destination and regasify it. That's about a $5, margin, give or take, from from what you buy that for here domestically and what are the ultimate customer. But what a huge opportunity. Japan market can absolutely absorb those kind of dollars right now, and it's important for us to be connected to those countries.
Staying on the natural gas thread, but pulling on a little bit more. And I think for the average person that maybe pays attention to the price of the pump, doesn't really understand the dynamics between oil and gas.
Natural gas and oil decoupled very early in the shale, in our shale revolution here. I remember it was in the, we were only a couple years into developing the Marcellus when those truly decoupled. And that's for a lot of reasons. The volume of natural gas production is happening in places where oil isn't happening. The exception of that has been the Permian Basin. So the Permian had so much associated gas, meaning that when you were drilling for oil, you happened to get the gas. That was being flared or vented early on, which obviously is a valuable resource that since then there's infrastructure to capture that. So that changed the natural gas dynamics, but it wasn't enough to recouple oil and gas. So gas has not been, affected tremendously in terms of pricing.
Sub $3.
Natural gas is much more of a domestic storage driven. That's why we see that, this tremendous seasonal, differences in gas prices and how that storage is done. Oil, as we know, is being affected much more globally. When 20% of, the global oil supply is coming through the Strait of Hormuz, and now we've got some additional potential supply constraints that we can't escape as a nation. We can't escape that kind of global dynamic.
And we will definitely get to the Strait of Hormuz in the Iranian conflict.
Right, Brent and West Texas. Brent crude is marked from a European and has a lot of history in the development of the North Sea oil. You look at that, and that's typically higher. There's been a recent time where that was flipped, which was crazy. I was like, whoa.
It was kind of up there with like May of 2020 when like someone was in the market.
It went negative.
Somebody was like, hey, here's $38, take this barrel of oil.
Yes, yeah. Those are outliers, right? But we could talk about that on a whole podcast. West Texas, is really kind of like our Henry Hub. It's our you trade against it, and it's the domestic version.
One of the big things that, from a Schneider Allen's perspective, that we have been overweight in client portfolios for a myriad of reasons since 2017 is real assets. So infrastructure, timberland and farmland to a certain extent, but really overweight infrastructure, both in public markets and in private markets for portfolios that kind of fit their goals and objectives. LNG is kind of front and center, kind of within the AI infrastructure supply chain equation, right? How do we power these immense data centers? I kind of get a kick out of it as a kid who grew up in Perry, Ohio, and we had a nuclear power plant that's still ongoing. I see Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, and he talks about like 10 gigawatts of energy as if it's like picking up a quarter off of the street.
Right. That doesn't just happen.
And it doesn't just happen. And I think that it's always good to be aspirational, right? America was built on aspirational thinking. I think that there is a misconception kind of perpetuated by some of these very innovative thinkers and creative people out in, kind of Silicon Valley. And LNG kind of sits at the...
When you say LNG, you mean natural gas.
Yeah, natural gas.
Isn't the export. It's
this is the base load fuel.
Yep.
That is going to power data centers, but also it powers a lot of other things. Can you talk about, some of the things that you are seeing within kind of power demand, and when does this eventually come to a head?
Right. The unknown, or the swing in that is a lot of public policy, right?
Sure.
So just as an example, southern tier of New York State has a ton of gas, just like the northeastern Pennsylvania has. It has been off limits, right? So right there, you've got supply that has not yet been tapped. You might hear talk of, the good drilling spots have been tapped out. Well, yeah, tapped out at 10% recovery, right? So, you take prices up a little bit, and all of a sudden you got a heck of a lot more economically viable location. I have huge confidence that we have the supply of energy in our country. I think the challenge is a disconnect between some of our policies and our needs. So to your point, we have the energy, but are we letting it get to where it needs to go? And do we have the right policies to protect consumers so they are supportive of what is a very important thing for our country to do, which is to be able to have this computing power?
Right. I think that there's, if you take it down, right, it's the US and China in terms of where they are. And I think the rest of these countries are going to figure out which horse to back. And I think right now, I think people are leaning towards the US, but they're keeping their options open, right? And you're seeing that strategically throughout the world. And I think from a geopolitical perspective, it makes sense that you want to leave open the possibility that the US doesn't win this race. To your point on how do you protect consumers, it's also how do you educate the consumers.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Because if everybody was looking at that PJM amount, we wouldn't have this disconnect about how our electricity is getting.
Because I think there's a very real fear of data centers consuming basically my air conditioning won't work if this data center is in my backyard.
Right.
Or my prices. And again, I think the cumulative effect of inflation, and I think you saw Chairman Warsh, of the Federal Reserve get very serious about this idea that, guys, like the 2%, like that means something to me.
Right.
That means something. That should mean something to all of us.
3% isn't okay.
3% isn't okay because there's this cumulative knock-on effect of everything else. And I think, the prices of electricity are really hurting. It hurts everyone, whether you own a home or you rent. I think it's important to know and understand that energy, it's a policy problem first, and we have shown that we can get the energy where we need it to go.
Well, I'm not sure I would totally agree with you on
Okay.
that. I think what we see in New England is really a travesty. So New York ISO and New England ISO, the grids up there, they are hurting because they don't have the assurance of supply on the coldest or the hottest, day of the year. If we think we're paying some extra prices here, it is crazy there. Plus, just from a using oil delivered to your oil tank in your basement isn't necessarily what we want to aspire to. So there are still bottlenecks, and that New England, New York is a great example of it. Perhaps the AI build out is a way to inject some reason politicians to hide behind how electricity really is getting delivered. Great if you have all of the above contributing to some of these data centers, but reliability is proving to be one of the the key decisions.
I think the the behind the meter battery storage, the ability for solar and some of these other more renewable resources to play a part in that.
Battery storage, BESS is huge. The behind the meter, I think, is maybe an oversimplification of what we really want at the end of the day. If I have assurances that my electric bill is not going to be burdened by a data center, I'd still rather have that generation on the grid than off the grid for optionality, for unforeseen circumstances. I don't want to let off the hook so quickly by just saying, you do it behind the meter, that's fine. There are some really important injections of capital right now to our grid that would be amazing to take advantage of for, building out what has been a neglected component of our infrastructure.
I couldn't agree more. And I think kind of pivoting maybe more towards kind of the regional aspect, you had mentioned, the Shell plant, the cracker plant in Monaca. Can you talk about, what is the state of the natural gas kind of in, kind of the Utica and Marcellus Shale?
Yeah.
How are we producing at rates that we need to be producing at? Is capital flowing into the region? And we kind of know, right? When capital comes into the region, there's a dynamism component to the overall economy, right? So,
well, yeah, I mean, about the third of the nation's natural gas, is coming from this basin right now. About a quarter is from the Permian, about 13% from the Haynesville, which is a Texas, Louisiana, a little more expensive to develop, but a very important geographic, basin, and the remaining third from the U.S. So, what's really important here in our basin is that we are very close to markets. And you mentioned Shell, where that comes together is, that plant is using natural gas for powering, using ethane for raw material in a place where the radius of their customer base is so huge. So location matters for this basin. I think the promise of additional generation out of this basin is only increasing with additional data center builds, even more outlets for our natural gas to the Gulf Coast for export, as well as just close to population centers.
And you think about how long it took to create that, like to build that plant out, right? I think it's you can't just snap your fingers and these things get built. And I think from an infrastructure standpoint, just in general, that to your point about locations matter, but like timing matters as well.
Well, and back to your point you were making earlier about the hyperscalers thinking that boom, overnight, energy is going to answer. There's like a physics reality. I think we have a lot of legacy assets here that are great, from using former power plants like what Homer City is doing. That you have that infrastructure in place, but those things don't get permitted overnight, even under the best of circumstances.
And one of the things you do have to factor in is how much it costs to actually build the infrastructure around it to pull it out.
Right.
And I think that
companies are being very disciplined about how they spend that.
And that's the big change. And that's maybe probably as good a transition into kind of the public markets. In 1985, 4 of the 10 largest companies in the S&P 500 were integrated energy companies: Exxon, Shell, Royal Dutch, and Amoco. Like, that was 4 of the 10. And now, the Magnificent Seven moving up, and now you're seeing some of these chip companies, Eli Lilly with what they're doing with the GLP-1s. But energy is like 3.5% of the S&P 500. And in my kind of humble opinion, it is the key. Underlying energy is the key to making all of that, all of the
rest of it.
The earnings, the expectations, the greatest dreams of our greatest innovators possible.
But there are some amazing technical breakthroughs when you think about from drilling horizontally, out a couple miles. But the costs have been, driven down. The productivity has been driven up, which is what you want to see. Yeah. The product, albeit a commodity, has been differentiated. Mm-hmm. There's even more, variety of outlets for that product. And the supply chain's been rationalized. This isn't a, Rolodex, can I get a guy to come pick this up or do that? I mean, the industry and its supply chain have really, used the last decade or two to be seamless on that. And M&A, which I'm sure, you're always looking at, that is alive and well in terms of further rationalizing, how this industry, operates. So I think, like you said, the things are all going in the right direction for us as, a citizenry. But
I think it's important because it's the natural segue into what I think is you go from the public markets. We have domestically, we have our house north. I think as you look through the strait, right, you go through our reliance on foreign sources for energy, and it's not just the Middle East, but just all sources of foreign oil and energy are at an all-time low. How much of the global market, from an oil perspective, it comes from the Strait of Hormuz?
About 20% comes through that.
Through, so 20% gets shipped through the Strait of Hormuz.
So it is somewhat incongruous that we are dependent here, or we don't have to worry about global oil or global natural gas because our production is at an all-time high, and yet the way those markets work still is that our oil prices in West Texas are still excesses, but I think those markets will shake themselves out. It would be so much worse, to your point, if we didn't have this resilience, if we didn't have this supply. Maybe the mainstream media isn't quite capturing that.
There's going to be volatility as long as there's conflict. How much volatility I think we can both agree is whatever volatility there is, it's going to be less than there otherwise would have been.
Right.
Eventually, these conflicts come to an end. I
mean, nothing is only one commodity, right? I mean, portfolios are diversified in a lot of different ways. And the fact that, we have oil and gas, natural gas that are decoupled, the fact that we have manufacturing opportunities that come about from this natural resource. I long ago gave up the thought of ever, thinking that you could predict these energy markets. And so, being diversified, in companies is a great way to go.
One of the things that you're not seeing, or at least the market, it's causing the market to pause, is that there appears to be a lack of discipline among the hyperscalers, whether it's Oracle, Google, Microsoft. They went from spending $71 billion combined in 2019 on AI CapEx to something like $500 billion this past year. It's going to grow to $730 billion next year, and then almost $1 trillion in 2028. So in our quarterly letter, I asked Alphabet's AI that's open. I just said, in today's dollars, how much did it cost the United States to build out the railroads? $10 billion was spent in the 1800s, which roughly equates to, depending on what metric you're using, between 250 and 300 billion in today's dollars.
Wow.
So we've spent twice that last year. We're going to spend almost 3 times that this year. Adjusted. And so there's a perceived lack of discipline. So now we have, these companies are by and large, incredibly disciplined. Talk about the transformation.
Yeah, there's been the M&A and consolidation and kind of putting the right assets with the right company.
Right.
And sometimes that's been trading back and forth between companies. I mean, there's it's more of a manufacturing model right now than an exploration model, which is always more predictable, planful. Those plans at the beginning of the year don't change like they did, before. You're also seeing, as I mentioned before, just costs get driven way down along the supply chain. There are no kind of false starts that there were early on the drilling, and then the productivity gains. I think where there is still less certainty, less reliability, goes back to this public policy, right? So if I want to build a pipeline, the last time around when I built it, I might have put a lot of money out there and then, was told I can't build it. So I think that just-in-time supply has gotten, more important.
Okay.
But I do think the reason we're seeing permitting such a big issue, I mean, it's not sexy at all. And yet Congress, and I think some leaders that are very important to us here, like, Senator Shelley Moore Capito and others, getting this permitting thing right, so you're not putting capital out that you'll never see again. That's real to companies. And so are we getting better at that? Probably a little better, but we're not quite there
and
yet.
Maybe the permitting is a place where you can have, both sides of the political aisle understand the importance to the region, so you can start to see some bipartisanship there.
We're already seeing that.
Which I think is incredibly important to the future of our national security. I firmly believe that energy, the ability to compete with China, we need both sides rowing together. And
participation's important, but not when it stops the ability to provide energy and life security to our population.
I think that the interesting thing is that maybe this, there's an all of the above, but an all of the above energy solution, but there's the misconceptions about, how clean, how the ability of, the natural gas producers to do it, to produce it in an effective and clean way that doesn't harm the environment. You hope this time around, as this build out is going to continue, that the education around that is also good. And I think that I would like to think that the safety standards find better ways over and over do it. And that's not just germane or relevant to energy, but that's going to be a fundamental issue around AI. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that the industry has done as it's kind of going into its next leg?
You hit on all of the above, which I think we have to be embracing at a more thorough level in this country. More is better. As long as we are not taking public dollars and putting it toward things that aren't going to be able to withstand the demand, right? I mean, so that's almost capitalism for energy. It's got to work. In terms of kind of the license to operate, I'm hoping we're beyond this kind of clean, not clean. Our regulations in this country are as strict as you can get around the globe for where, when I mentioned earlier, we're in competition with about 20 countries that produce natural gas for export. Some of those countries do not come anywhere. They can't hold a candle.
So kind of, putting a bow on this conversation, I would say that from a high level, the U.S. is in a very good position to not only meet the demands of its population, in terms of what we need to get out of the grid, what we need to get out of our power sourcing, but also the ability to unleash power to fuel this AI revolution. But there are some policy and permitting hurdles that need to come through. But is there anything, if there was one thing you wanted to leave kind of the people that are going to listen to this and the folks that are going to watch it, is there one thing you'd want to leave them with, whether it's, something to watch for, the pivot point of something, one thing to leave them with before we wrap it up?
Well, we've covered a lot. And, I think that the all of the above is important, but maybe to really end on education. Energy is such an easy thing to get politicized. And I think we've all been taken advantage of along those lines, and looking at energy not as a pro-environment or anti-environment, but looking at it as a human quality of life, and being agnostic as to where that comes from, as long as it's economically makes sense and that, you know, it's regulated in a way that, you know, protects ourselves, our children, you know, our communities. And that education is not easy, but it's important enough that I think, you know, we as a country are going to be so much better if we really dig into that and not just look at the headlines.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. For those that are going to be watching this again, this was taped on Tuesday morning, July 21st. So I'm sure we'll have you on again. But Katie, thank you so much for joining us.
Appreciate it.